Oh, I have lots of.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
We had a few technical difficulties with our connection to our New York office, but they've been resolved, and so I'd like to open our October 29th meeting and turn first to our minutes from our public session from September 24th, our last meeting. Do I have a motion, please? Second?
Second.
All in favor of approving the minutes?
Aye.
Aye. Any noes? Seeing none, the minutes are approved. I'd now like to turn to our Chief of Staff, Monica Stam, to give us an update on three items, please, that are on the agenda.
I just wanted to remind everyone that the financial disclosure statements for academic filers will be filed on November 15th. They're due on November 15th. That's about, I think, 5,300 filings that we are expecting to get. So staff is preparing for those filings, and those will come in hopefully on time on November 15th. In addition, we have now updated the lobbying data on our website. So for the first time this year, we had made a downloadable spreadsheet available with the complete lobbying data, and that's been updated to include the first part of this year. And so that's available now. We decided to also break out that portion of data from the annual report and do a press release on that information, which was circulated, to give a snapshot of the activity during the legislative session. And that showed that there was an overall drop in lobbying spending attributable to the drop in advertising spending over that period of time, but that compensation tends to remain fairly stable among lobbyists. And that the big client spenders for that period included big tobacco and the retailer coalitions pushing against the proposed New York City ban on tobacco displays, as well as the teachers union, health care, Major League Soccer, and gambling. So that's the update on the lobbying data, which is now available on our website. And the last item that I wanted to present is the second quarter financial report, which normally Janine Clementi does, but she's not available today. So to date, for the second quarter, we spent approximately $1.5 million in personal services, which is about 41% of our cash for personal services, and about $300,000 in non-personal services, which is about 38% of our cash for this year on non-personal services. So overall, we've spent about 41% of our cash that's available for the agency at the end of the second quarter. Any questions? Okay, that's that.
Thank you, Monica. I'm going to turn to item 4 on our public agenda. We have got a number of proposed regulations to a number of substantive areas, but I want to first start by asking Monica to give us an update on our proposed amended source of funding regulations, where at our last meeting we adopted emergency regulations on the exemptions to the source of funding rules that we have.
Right. So those regulations have now been published in the state register, so the pursuant to SAPA, and so that we're accepting public comments on those regulations. They're also posted on our website, and the public comment period will end on December 23rd. So from now through December 23rd, we're accepting comments. And as you recall, there were 2 amendments in those regulations, which we are going to discuss one of those later today. But we changed the standard for review for exemptions to substantial likelihood of harm, and we changed the process for applying for exemptions.
Which we're going to talk about. Once we get through item 4, we'll turn to the specific applications, and we'll get a report from our subcommittee that worked on coming up with a process to implement the exemption process. But before we do that, let's turn to the various proposed amendments to the regulations that we need to consider today. So again, Monica, could you walk us through the first one, which is amendments to the public service announcement regs.
Sure. So as you'll recall, we've been working on draft public service announcement regulations for part of this year. We've been going through an informal process where staff has been preparing the regulations and working with the regulated community to get comments and work through what the regulations should be. And we now have a version of those regulations that we are putting forward for the Commission to consider to adopt, so that it will now go through the SAPA process, would be published in the state register, and we would receive formal public comments so that these regs could go into effect. I'm going to turn it over to Rob Cohen, our Director of Ethics and Lobbying Compliance, to talk about the specifics of the regulations.
The proposed regulations reflect a general public policy that supports and encourages public service announcements. So to this end, the proposed regs clarify that a public service announcement featuring a state officer or employee or a member of the legislature will ordinarily not be considered a gift under the Public Officers Law. At the same time, however, the regulations also recognize that public service announcements that are published near an election in which an individual is running for office could be used or seen as a vehicle to promote that person's candidacy. So the regulations discourage the appearance of certain state officers and employees, statewide elected officials, the 4 statewide elected officials, members of the legislature, and heads and executive directors of state agencies. Those individuals under the regulations are discouraged from appearing in public service announcements in the 90 days preceding any election in which they are a candidate for state office. And the regulations effectuate this deterrence by making clear that when one of these individuals appears in a public service announcement during this 90-day blackout period and knows and intends that the public service announcement will be published during the 90-day blackout period, that constitutes a violation of Section 74 of the Public Officers Law.
What provision of 74?
74.3D specifically. We received, as Monica said, these regulations were subject to an informal public comment period. We received a few public comments on the regulations, or a few comments on the regulations. As a result of those comments, staff has proposed some minor technical modifications to the regulations, but in sum and substance, they are very similar to what was initially published on the website for informal public comment.
Could you indicate to us what was controversial about these and what got changed? If there was
well,
anything
there was nothing
controversial.
that was particular, nothing of substance got changed, or some clarifications. Some entities were concerned, some entities leveled a number of different concerns with the regulations with respect to the blackout period, or the general prohibition about appearing during the blackout period. But upon further discussion with in particular, a trade association, and some clarifications to the language, I don't want to speak for them, but my understanding is that their objections were satisfied. It was really more a misunderstanding as to the intent and purpose of the regulations that was clarified by some minor changes. So,
Rob, I have some questions, some large, some small. Let's start with 940.1, the purpose, where it stated Jacob is authorized to adopt, amend. I'm not sure that's wholly consistent with the statute, which actually, I believe, requires us. It says the commission shall, and maybe the word require or mandate is better used than authorized in this particular, because it was a direction from the legislature to do so.
I need to find the provision of it's the mandate is in 94. And
It's 94.9.
9D-1.
Sure, I mean, we could, it's up to
That's-
the commission, but there's no staff objection to modifying that language there.
The next question I have relates to,
Are we changing the word?
well, that's my suggestion. It's what the statute says. If somebody's looked at it,
We follow the statute.
The next question or comment I have relates to the definition of state agency. And it seems that community colleges under the state university are not included. Well, how are community colleges of CUNY treated under the definition of state agency?
My understanding, this language is taken from the definition of state agency that, with some modifications, not in substance, but in style to make it what we thought was clearer, from the definition of state agency in, I believe, yes, in Public Officers Law 73(1)G.
So I guess my question is, how are the community college, are they now sort of included as a definition of state agency for CUNY but not for SUNY?
I would have to defer to, sure, do you know the answer to that? For the purposes of Public Officers Law 73, generally?
Could you repeat the question about CUNY?
Yes, I'm trying to sort out, under this definition of state agency, community colleges of SUNY, which are those all except for within the city university system, appear to be excluded. I'm just curious as to how the CUNY community colleges are treated for purposes of this definition.
CUNY is regulated, so it's not considered a community college. So it would come with.
Yes, but the community colleges of CUNY would be included, but not those of SUNY. It's the question. Just the
Plain reading
Just the question. It's the question.
Right. I mean, I think if you wanted to be further, based on the language in the statute.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure, that's,
I mean, I'm just looking at the
Yeah.
statute, we're having this conversation, so I'm looking at the definition of, in 73G, and obviously the staff knows their stuff. I mean, it's clear that this is how the legislature defined community college, so this regulation appears to be tracking the language of the statute that the legislature enacted.
that's fine. It's just a question. I don't,
Sure.
as I'm going,
Sure.
I was reading this in a long flight. The next question I have is, and this is more towards the commission under state officer employee, under H6 in the whole. Just arguably, would this or would this not apply to commission members? 940.2, H6 in the whole.
I do not believe it would apply to commission
Okay.
members, because the commission members are compensated on a per diem
That's-
basis.
That's right.
Yeah,
Right, right.
okay. And my last question goes to not my last, I guess I got one more. 940.3B, where you have examples of public service announcements. And I was just wondering, at the end, where you speak to fund drives for charitable programs, whether we might not want to consider expanding that slightly to say, or activities, because oftentimes there are a lot of one and done.
Understand?
And the last question I have is, at the end, 940.5, be in the whole, and deals with declared state of emergency. Is that sufficient, or do you have to note that it's subject, it's in accordance with state or federal law? I mean, or is there, okay, we have enough judges around the table could tell us whether we could take judicial notice of what a declared state of emergency is.
And then you get reversed.
We had considered further refining that and including language about a federal or state, and we decided to just keep it a declared state of emergency. I'm not particularly well versed on who is able to declare a state of emergency. I know that on the federal level, on the state level, I don't know if there's on the county level perhaps. So we left it intentionally open.
Okay.
I
have a question.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to remind the commissioners that if the regs are adopted, it will go out for formal comments, and obviously we can consider any additional changes at this time. So this is just to begin the formal rulemaking process. So if there are suggestions along those lines, that we could certainly incorporate them.
Rob, if I could direct your attention to 940.5, where the language says that covered official knowingly and intentionally appear in a public service announcement that with the knowledge and intention that such announcement would be published during the 90-day period. The way this is written, at least as I read it, the public official, the covered person, could know that the organization intends to publish it in the 90-day period, and that would not be prescribed because it would have to be the intent and knowledge of the official. So, it seems to me that there's a way that you could say, I personally didn't intend for it to be published. They could have knowledge that that there's an intent by the organization to publish it, and that would be fine.
Well, so we attempted to capture that by using the passive, would be published. So would be published presumably by the entity that is airing the public service announcement. So our intent was to capture a situation like that, where the covered official, to use the terminology of the regs, knew that the public service announcement was intended to be and would be published by whatever entity is the subject of the public service announcement within the 90-day period. I think that gets to...
I don't know if I agree that the way it's written and currently drafted adequately addresses it.
Okay, well, if it's up to the commission, we can work on language before submitting it for formal public comment, or wait for the formal public comment. But the intent was clearly to capture a situation like you described.
A lot of times the PSAs are at the discretion of the individual sort of television stations too. They just pick them up and they are able to fill 30s that are around, so they don't even know.
Right. I understand, which is why there's the knowing and intentional language in there. Also, in order to find that an individual has violated the public officers law, the violation has to be knowingly and intentional. So the language comes from the statutory prescription, but is also informed by the circumstances that you described, where if an individual just simply has no control over it, it would not necessarily be a violation of the public officers law.
What part of D is the violation focused on? 74.3D.
74.3D, I'll turn to the statutory language.
Right.
It prohibits a state officer, employee, or member of the legislature from using or attempting to use his or her official position to secure unwarranted privileges or exemptions for himself or others. So,
Go on.
including but not limited to the misappropriation to himself, herself, or others of the property, services, or resources of the state for private business or other compensated non-governmental
The
purposes.
latter language, of course, doesn't apply, but you're coming in under the broader before the including?
Exactly, coming in under the language that
Just
precedes.
the general language.
Right, that precedes the including but not limited to.
Okay.
I asked a question around, this has to do with separation of powers. As I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, each house has its own rules with respect to incumbent publications prior to elections. If the rules of one of the houses were to end up being inconsistent with the election, how is that resolved?
Well, let me address that first by saying that we endeavored to write the regulations in such a way so as to avoid the type of conflict that you described. It is, because remember, so there's 940.3 has a definition of what constitutes a public service announcement. So if a communication from a member of the legislature doesn't satisfy the definition of a public service announcement, then it wouldn't be covered by these regulations. So it wouldn't be in conflict with the regulations.
theoretically or hypothetically, one of these incumbent newsletters that goes out would fall within the ambit of our definition. It would also be covered by the rules and so on. To me, this seems a very reasonable, cogent approach, but I would suggest that you just have a sidebar conversation with the Legislative Ethics Commission, tell them what we're doing.
And we have been in contact with them, but Commissioner, I would suggest that any publication coming from a member of the legislature, under a newsletter or such, would just plainly not be a public service announcement under the definition.
Yeah.
So, and that was intentional. We intentionally crafted the regulations so as to avoid that potential conflict.
Thank you.
So, are there any other comments or questions on this particular regulation? If there aren't, with one change that Commissioner Weissman identified. Two, I'm sorry, in 940.1, which would be to strike the words, is authorized to, and insert the word shall. That was one, and then...
I have a proposal that might address mine.
Sure. Go ahead, Commissioner D'Arcy.
With respect to 940.5, what I would suggest, I would address the concern that I raised, is that the sentence that the covered official knowingly and intentionally appeared in a public service announcement, that with, delete the word the and insert actual instead of the, knowledge, and then delete and intentional, so that it just reads, with actual knowledge that such public service announcement would be published in the 90-day period. That's my proposal.
May I just comment on that? And it's just a point to ponder. I want to make sure in order to have a violation under Section 74, it has to be a knowing and intentional violation,
right,
which is why we included the word intention.
But isn't the knowingly and intentionally captured in the first clause of that, the previous clause, that the covered official knowingly and intentionally, you have it there.
Right. So the thinking behind the language was that there's two aspects to the knowing. The knowing and intentional requirement is applied to two different aspects. One is the actual appearance in a public service announcement, and the second is that the public service announcement is then published or aired in the 90-day blackout period.
Oh, I thought I thought the only thing we were seeking to prescribe, and therefore to describe in terms of intent, was the 90-day blackout period. So I read the knowing and intentionally, as it's currently drafted, as addressing the 90-day blackout period, because the regs they're not drafted to prevent people from appearing in public service announcements. They're drafted, this provision is supposed to only go towards the 90-day period, the 90-day blackout period, right?
No, that's it. Right. That is right.
So if that's the purpose, then the knowingly and the intentionally is modifying the blackout period, because we certainly have no issue with people appearing in public service announcements.
You're exactly right. It was maybe a boots and suspenders attempt here.
Yeah.
I have no qualms with what you're saying at all.
Right.
We just wanted to ensure we were being, in some sense, extra careful that the regulation here comports with the requirements to find a violation under
No,
74.
I get it. I
So-
just think that as written, the problem is that someone could have actual knowledge that someone is, and they're purposely doing this, intending to have it go in the 90-day blackout period, and they have knowledge of it. And if the way it's currently written, that would be a loophole that would allow them to get around it. We can talk about it.
Sure. I mean, again, this is open for, we'll submit it for public comment. That's certainly a very fair and reasonable way to construct a statute or the regulation.
I mean, I happen to agree with Commissioner D'Arcy that what you don't want is you don't want somebody filming a PSA outside of the prescribed 90-day period, but knowing that that PSA is going to actually appear in the 90-day period, and you want to be absolutely certain, because that's really the conduct that we're trying to prescribe here. Appearing in the PSA before the 90-day blackout period is not the gravamon of the violation. The gravamon is that you both appear in the PSA and it runs with your knowledge during that period of time. So I guess we can do a couple of things. I mean, one, we could go forward and vote on these regulations as written with the understanding, because we've had a pretty full public discussion, that the commission is going to consider an additional modification to this particular provision, along with the two changes that Commissioner Weissman made, in the interest of time. If that, I'd ask the staff, is that, I'd like the staff's view on whether that's permissible, and obviously solicit the commissioner's view, if that's an appropriate way, or if that's a way that the commission would like to proceed at this point. Commissioner Yaroshelski?
Yeah, I agree with you. And in the interest of time, I just want to suggest, given the fact we have a full agenda, we have 4 applications of source of funding to consider publicly as well as other business, my suggestion is that the following, we have 4 other proposed regulations. Given the fact that they're open for public comment, that we submit our comments to the staff, and that perhaps we have 1 or 2 people from this body who works with the staff to go over any suggestions. Otherwise, we're going to spend, we have to spend half an hour on one regulation, and we can't afford to be here all day.
That's
fair.
that's a very useful comment. So does that mean that so let me just be clear, do we want to take votes on these, or do we want to, with the want to defer the discussion and have a subcommittee work with the staff on these
Yes,
to report back at the next
that's my
meeting?
proposal, that the subcommittee work with the staff.
Okay.
And then everybody put their comments in writing for the following 4 proposed regulations.
I think that's a fine idea, unless anybody objects to that. Let's do that, and if anybody's interested in serving on the regulation subcommittee, send me an email or give me a buzz.
Can I make just one comment? Just one more comment
Yes,
for
ma'am.
clarification. Commissioner Yaroshelski spoke
Yes.
about that process applying to all 4.
5.
I'm not sure if that's precisely the way it makes sense, I think, for the PSAs, but the other regulations have already been submitted for public comment.
Right.
So you might want to defer
Okay.
Well, let me just
that process. until
Right, so I
there's
think
some
what
discussion.
Rob is trying to say is that the only reg that we're currently considering to enter the SAPA process is the one that we've been discussing. The others, as I understand it, and I agree with you, Ellen, that we should work with a subcommittee to move things along. The others are regulations that have either been fully submitted and gone through the process where there are some technical changes that need to be made. But again, I think that you make a wise and prudent suggestion. So why don't we continue this discussion at our next meeting after we have a subcommittee to move through some of these issues. Okay, so that takes us to item 5 on our public agenda, which applications from exemptions from our source of funding disclosure requirements. Let me just preface the next piece of our discussion by saying that we'd like to have, a brief presentation by the staff on the standards by which we are to judge the source of funding exemption requests, and then to get a brief report from one of the members of our subcommittee who worked on the implementation of the process for exemptions. And I want to thank the members of that subcommittee who worked very hard and under some time constraints to come up with those processes. Commissioners Levine, DRC, Weissman, and Arroyo, and Commissioner Rath as well. I'm sorry, Commissioner Roth as well. So I want to thank you for that. So what I'd like to do is ask Rob to give us a brief discussion of the standards, and then I'm going to ask Commissioner Levine on behalf of the subcommittee to give us a brief overview of the changes, and then pursuant to our new processes, we'll adjourn to executive session to determine the merits of the requests of 3 of the applicants for confidentiality, and then return to the public session to report the results of our deliberations. So, Rob, if you would, please.
Sure, just a very brief overview for the Commissioner. We're only going to be talking about the exemptions from the source of funding disclosure law. These are contained in our regulations, Part 938.
Gary?
To begin with, just to refresh everyone's memory, the Lobbying Act, or the legislative law, requires that that the client of a lobbyist is required to file a semi-annual report. In the semi-annual report, a client of a lobbyist must disclose sources of funding over $5,000 from a single source. If 2 requirements are met, the client to spend over $50,000 for reportable compensation and expenses for lobbying during a specified time period, and at least 3% of the total expenditures during this time period were devoted to lobbying in New York. So a client of a lobbyist that meets that criteria is again required to report the sources of funding over $5,000 from a single source. So the exemptions, and we're going to deal, there are a couple different exemptions under the regulations and under the Lobbying Act. The exemptions that are at issue today pertain to 501c4 organizations that are registered under the Internal Revenue Code, Section 501c4. So, under the regulations and under the Lobbying Act, a client of a lobbyist that is a registered 501c4 entity may apply to the Commission for a blanket exemption from the disclosure obligations for its sources of funding. The requirements for an exemption are stated right here. It's an entity, and I'll just read it, whose primary activities concern any area of public concern determined by the Commission to create a substantial likelihood, that is the operative standard, that application of this disclosure requirement would lead to harm, threats, harassments, or reprisals to a source of funding or to individuals or property affiliated with such source, including but not limited to the area of civil rights and civil liberties. Under the regulations, there are identified groupings of evidence that the Commission may consider in determining whether the substantial likelihood standard has been met. They are specific evidence of past or present harms, threats, harassment, or reprisals to the sources or to the client filer, or individuals or property affiliated with either the sources of funding or the entity that is applying for the application. The severity, number of incidents, and duration of past or present harm. Again, that's past or present harm or threats directed not just at sources of funding, but also at the client filer itself. Pattern of threats or manifestations of public hostility against these sources of funding or the client filer itself. Evidence of harm, threats, harassment, or reprisals directed against organizations or individuals holding views similar to those of the sources or client filers. So this category, again, pertains to not necessarily to harm or threats against the entity seeking an exemption, but harms or threats that were leveled against entities holding similar views with similar missions, so on and so forth. And then the final factor is the impact of disclosure on the ability of the source or the client filer to maintain ordinary business operations and economic harm.
Thank you, Rob. I'm sorry, I apologize to Commissioner Renzi. He was also a member of the subcommittee, an important member of the subcommittee. So, Dave, I'm sorry for leaving you out, but I was very happy that you were able to participate. So, my apologies. Thank you, Rob. Unless there are any questions, I'd like Commissioner Levine to give a brief summary of the processes that the subcommittee came to before we take up the specific request for confidentiality in executive session.
Thank you. The committee met by telephone conference call on October 14th and on October 18th. It was an in-depth animated discussion, as usual with this group. The committee task at hand was to consider the process for entertaining applications for exemption and to consider previous decisions made by the commission in light of the commission determination to utilize the statutory standard. A number of alternatives and options were considered, very carefully considered. I would suggest, Mr. Chair, that we have a specific discussion in executive session owing to the potential, I don't want to say likelihood, but the potential perhaps for some litigation arising from the transition from the previous standard to the newly instituted standard. So I'd suggest we do that in executive session.
Okay. All right. So under our processes now that we can thank the subcommittee for its excellent work, we have 3 applicants of the 4 who have requested that their applications be considered in executive session. And so I'd entertain a motion to adjourn into executive session for us to consider the merits of those requests. And then when we conclude those deliberations, we can come back into public session to complete the public session portion of our discussion of these exemptions. Any seconds?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Seeing none? Okay, so we're going to go into executive session now, and I ask the members of the public to... typo.
No, that's fine. I just didn't.
Fights and stands outside. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I did.
And
What happened?
John? Okay. We're back in public session. During our executive session, we had a discussion involving the 3 applications that were submitted with requests for confidentiality. I will point out that these applications were submitted only in the last day or so, and the Commission has decided that given the fact that the timing of the submission, we need to take additional time to review these materials, which again we only just received. So we're going to adjourn our consideration of these matters until our next meeting. And with that, that takes us to item 6 of our public agenda, new and other business. Commissioner Yarashevsky?
Yes, I have a matter that I'd like to raise, and I have a motion in that regard regarding our search for our executive director. I'm now part of the administrative committee. Before I joined, our previous administrative committee had considered a number of applications, and that's been going on for months and months, and hadn't reached a conclusion. At our administrative committee meeting, I don't know, it was about a month ago, we discussed the idea that had been circulated by a number of commissioners that this commission employ a search firm, that search firms have been used by other organizations to hire executive directors. And I undertook the responsibility to find such a firm. I talked to two of them, and as you all know, I submitted an email to all of you with a proposal from someone I had spoken to who's highly regarded, highly reputable, and I had spoken with her for some period of time. She put forth a proposal with the details of the way she would conduct such a search, and it was my recommendation that we do so, and I make that motion today that we actually decide to employ a search firm. I know that we received a response from Dan indicating that one of the concerns is obviously timing, because we've been waiting such a long time to get a new executive director, and I understand that it is important, but we've been working for many months without one, and so my view is an additional few months is not going to make that much difference, particularly because it's so important to this commission to have an independent person, independent of both the legislature and the executive branch, and I think it's incumbent upon us to do that. And secondly, in terms of taxpayer money, I understand that it does cost some taxpayer money to do this. I think the terms that were suggested are eminently reasonable, and I think long-term, for the existence of this commission, it would be really important to actually request that expenditure of taxpayer money. It's a very small part of our budget, and I think it would be worthwhile so that we actually are independent and that we're perceived to be independent. So I make that motion that we hire a search firm, and the search firm that I'm suggesting.
I gather, sorry, I stepped out for a moment, that we're discussing the executive director.
No, we're discussing new and other business, and Commissioner Yarashevsky has made a motion to
Give it a second.
for the commission to engage a search firm to find candidates for the executive director. I will echo what I said in an email when Commissioner Yarashevsky raised that. We have had a robust process to search for an executive director candidate. We received 70.
May I interrupt you, actually? Without prejudice to the motion, it may have happened, but I can't recall any board that I've served in, federal, state, or county, and I've been in all three branches, where a personnel matter was not discussed in executive session. I mean, it may have happened, but I don't recall it. So I think the first thing we have to entertain is, since it's obviously a personnel matter, whether it should be an executive session.
Well, I think that's right.
I'm not talking about individuals, I'm talking about the process, and I think the process is a public
But I don't think it can be
process.
separated from the whole discussion about what it is we're looking for, what
I
the
agree.
job spec would be, and all of that.
Maybe the best thing is to vote on the motion. and
Look, I'll
see-
second that motion.
Well,
Which
I-
motion? What
Ellen's
motion?
Yeah.
Well, I will say that we have had a robust process to find an executive director, and I will
May I
add,
ask what that process was? I know I'm late to the dance, but...
we
that I
posted
was-
advertisements in major news outlets. We've had a posting on our website. We had an admin committee review 73 resumes. We conducted 8 interviews. We narrowed the candidates down to 4. We've interviewed them. I will add that when we searched for executive director, our first executive director, I was a member of that search committee, and this concept of hiring an executive search firm was raised and rejected then, and we ended up hiring an executive director who I think by all estimates served us very well. I do agree with the issues that a number of the commissioners have raised, that by statute, by law, personnel matters, whether it's the process or specific candidates, are to be handled in executive session.
Would you
And
entertain an amendment to your motion that it be discussed in executive session?
No, it's not an amendment, it's a motion.
I have a
Well, no,
motion
we
on the
shouldn't.
table. I think that the question of whether we hire a search firm ought to be discussed publicly. I think it's time that we be a little more transparent.
We did end up with 4 finalists, none of whom were brought up for a vote to this commission except possibly what might happen later today, despite efforts by me and others to bring names to the commission for a vote. So if it was robust, it failed in that important aspect.
I have to just say, I'm uncomfortable with this, the fact that this conversation is continuing to ensue in a public session. I think it's impossible for us to have a fulsome discussion of your motion without us treading on murky waters that I think should be discussed in the executive session. I don't think that you can separate the two. And so I'm not certain how it is that we just continue to proceed. It must, the commission agrees that that's how we should proceed.
As the chair, I'm going to make a ruling that this motion is in contravention of our meeting rules, and we're going to take it up in executive session. It is not an appropriate...
Well, why don't you submit, I don't think that follows Robert's Rules of Order. Why don't you just, and maybe someone else will move that we go into executive session.
Well, I'll entertain that motion.
Well, first you have to entertain my
Is her
motion.
Yes.
on the table?
You can defeat the motion, but you just can't ignore it.
Yeah, I don't think we can do that while her motion's on the
Okay.
table.
It's been seconded, yeah.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
I
Commissioner
believe
Vaughn.
that there should be an executive session, like a ruling from the chair on a point of order.
That's what I was attempting to do, make a ruling on a point of order, that it's the
When you
motion
make a
that
ruling,
is...
let's have a vote.
Okay,
on
the
it
ruling is
before
that the
chair.
motion can be entertained in executive session, but not in public session. Can I have a motion to adjourn unless there's any other new business? May I have a motion to adjourn into executive session, please?
So moved.
Second? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
Opposed.
Okay. The ayes carry the motion. We are now going into executive session.